All right, in this module, we're going to talk about centering translations and Bravais lattices. So how we identify Bravais lattices of a given structure. But let's start with a bit of review. I've already mentioned that if we have one lattice point per unit cell, so an example of a primitive lattice is here, where we have one lattice on each corner, and that adds up to 1, because we saw that if we center it, we can center it around one point, or if you're thinking about each of these points, it's shared by 8 unit cells, and therefore each of these counts 1/8, and so 8 times 1/8, we get 1 lattice point per unit cell. But there are other cases where we can have more than one lattice point per unit cell. So that's also possible. So these would be non-primitive unit cells. And so those are going to have lattice points that aren't at integer point coordinates like we have here, right? These are all variants of 1, 0, 0. And so they're all at integers. An example is, for example, the body-centered point. So for this, if I have typical points on the vertices, and then one right in the center of the unit cell. So that's at a 1/2, 1/2, 1/2 point, right? So that's a sorry about that. So that's a non-integer lattice point. So for these non-primitive unit cells, we often want to think about a vector that can translate from the origin to that non-primitive site. So, if we're taking, for example, this point here as the origin, and we want to translate to the non-primitive point. So this would be the body centering vector, right? So this would take us from the origin to the body-centered point. And so this is going to be in the family of 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. So here I don't care about the fractions. I'm not concerned with that. I'm just trying to emphasize the given direction. And so we could think about any one of these 1/2, 1/2, 1/2 points that would take us from a corner to a body-centered position. So that's known as our body centering vector. This is an example of a centering translation that we can have. But there's going to be other centering translations. And so others, so we have the body centered, we just talked about that. So that's going to be this 1/2, 1/2, 1/2 style. We can also have a face centering. So if you remember from our Bravais lattices, you might have seen that in the list. So when we talk about faces, we're talking about the faces of one of these unit cells. So if it's centered on the face, and so we're talking about that kind of point, or over here on this face, right? So that's a face centering, and those are going to have centering translations of the type 1/2, 1/2, 0, or again, since it's a family, it can be any sort of permutation of 1/2, 1/2, 0. And we can also have what we call base centering. So the difference here is that face centering, when we have a face centering lattice, we have points on all of the faces, all 8 of them. However, in base centering, it only is one type. So we only have, for example, in the y direction, we would only have points on the y-axis, or the z-axis, or the x-axis, right? So we would have those in that case. So this direction here. So that's of the type. So they're similar to face centering, but only in one direction. So those are either 1/2, 1/2, 0, or 1/2, 0, 1/2, and so it's only this type, not all of them, or and I'll do it out of order here, 0, 1/2, 1/2. So it can be any three of those, but we're only talking about one direction. So one axis at a time. So those are some examples of sintering translations that we can end up with for various Bravais lattices that you're likely to see. All right, now I want to talk about Bravais lattices and how we identify and construct Bravais lattices for various crystal structures. So I mentioned in the previous lecture that we had 14 total Bravais lattices and that everything else can be boiled down to one of those 14. Right? So these are all the possible point lattices. But we still only have points associated with these geometric shapes, right? We still haven't defined a motif. And the motif is where we incorporate atoms, ions, molecules. And so that's what we want to talk about right now. And so to start, let's look at silicon, Si, right? So if you look up silicon, you're going to see that this has what's called a diamond cubic structure, sometimes abbreviated to DC. So if you think about this, the diamond cubic structure is not a Bravais lattice, right? If you go back and look, we only have primitive cubic, body center cubic, and face cubic in that geometric configuration. So diamond is not a Bravais lattice. This is a crystal structure, which means it has atoms, ions, or molecules associated with a Bravais lattice. And so what we want to do is determine what the Bravais lattice of silicon is, right? That's what we want to do. We want to be able to identify what the Bravais lattice is and then what the motif of that is. And so to do that, I'm going to switch over and we're going to look at a diagram of silicon. All right. So this is a slide that's looking at the diamond structure, and we just talked about this being silicon, but it could also be other structures. Carbon and germanium also have the same structure. So this is, if you look at a unit cell of anything that has the diamond cubic structure, this is what you're going to see. So we have points on the vertices, we have points in the face centering position, so on all the faces, but we also in addition have these points, and they're of the type 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. So they're in these quadrants, so to speak, of the structure. And so when we want to talk about the Bravais lattice, we already know that it is not the diamond Bravais lattice because that doesn't exist. So we have to take one of the other Bravais lattices that exist. So in this case, we are limited to either primitive cubic, body-centered cubic, or face cubic because it is cubic in nature. And so the possibilities are, what can we start as with a Bravais lattice and build up to the structure that we have. So the answer here is the face-centered cubic, or FCC Bravais lattice. So that is the vertices plus those face centerings. And we take that and we build in what's called our motif, as I said before, but might also be called basis, as you can see here. And the basis is the combination of atoms, ions, or molecules that we build onto this point lattice to build our structure. So what we do is we take the FCC lattice, where we have points on the corners and also the face positions, and for each one of those points we have a 2-atom motif. So if we, instead of putting 1 atom per point, we're actually putting 2. And so that's the important part here. So if you think about every point on this lattice, a vertice or a face-centered position, and you add in this basis, this 2 atoms, and they're separated by a vector of 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. You can think of this as that centering vector. And so if you put that at each point, you will build up this structure. So if that's not super clear, you might kind of sketch this out for yourself. But for example, if we put this basis on the point here, we're going to have one atom here of silicon here, and then at the 1/4 position here. And that's where we get this point over here. And if we do that for all of them, if you do one for the face center position here, you'll get another one back here, and that's this atom. And so if you keep building that up, you'll build up the diamond structure. So when we talk about the diamond cubic structure, it has a FCC Bravais lattice, because that's the simplest point lattice that we can use to build up that structure. So that's important. And we call this a non-Bravais structure because we have 2 atoms per point. And so that's the other part of this. So we have 8 atoms total per site because we're putting 2 on each point, and FCC already has 4. So that's how we get sort of those numbers associated with Bravais, the diamond cubic structure. So this is how we can kind of think of all structures, is we can take any structure that we come up with, and we can break it down to one of those 14 Bravais lattices plus a motif or basis of atoms, ions, or molecules that we add on to each of those points. And that's what builds up our various crystal structures that are possible. And so that's the power of using Bravais lattices to discuss the various structures. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about Bravais lattices and how we define them for crystal structures, what I want you to do is take a look at the cesium chloride structure that I've drawn, and there's also a picture in your quiz. And what I want you to do is think back to the example we did with silicon and finding the Bravais lattice and the motif for silicon, and I want you to do the same thing for cesium chloride, the structure that I've drawn here. What is the Bravais lattice for cesium chloride? And then what motif do we build onto that Bravais lattice to get the cesium chloride structure? So go ahead, go to the quiz and see if you can determine Bravais lattice and motif for cesium chloride. All right, now that you've had a chance to answer this question about the Bravais lattice and the motif of the cesium chloride structure, let's take a look at what we get. So the first instinct might be to say that this structure, which has chlorine on the corners and cesium in the body-centered position, might be to say that the Bravais lattice is body-centered cubic. However, we have 2 different ions here, right? One set of ions is on the corner, and one set of ions is in this body-centered position. So we can't have a Bravais lattice of BCC because we have different points, or sorry, different ions associated with different points. So we have to break it down to something more simple. So it's not BCC, and it can't be FCC. So it ends up being simple or primitive cubic. And that's our Bravais lattice. So how we think of this is, again, a simple or primitive cubic Bravais lattice has points on the corners, right? So what this means is that we have a simple Bravais lattice. Again, there's a difference between Bravais lattice and the crystal structure, but we have multiple ions associated with each point, right? Because we only have one lattice point per unit cell. So in this case, we have simple cubic, and our motif is going to start, and we can think of the chlorine. So we have a chlorine at each lattice point, right? So you can clearly see that here. Each of the corners, each of the lattice points has a chlorine atom. So we kind of put this as we have a chlorine at the 0, 0, 0. So this indicates that we have one chlorine for each lattice point. I don't have to write out all 8 of them, right? Because there's only one lattice point per unit cell. So I just choose to use the origin. But we still have to think about the cesium, right? And we have one cesium per unit cell. So that means that we also have to have a cesium ion, and that's at, we can see from the picture there, at the body center, which is 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, right? So essentially, our motif is these two, right? So this combination of an atom is our motif. We can build up the cesium chloride structure by thinking about one chlorine at each lattice point, and then another one associated with that point, but at a separated by a vector 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, right? So if we build this up, so if I draw this so if I think about this as each point having a chlorine and cesium, I can make this whole structure, right? So if I thought about this point up here, it's also going to have a body-centered point up here. And if you could draw them all out, you would have points associated. So this one would be in the next, this associated with the chlorine here would be in the next unit cell above the unit cell that I've drawn. But I don't have to worry about that. I'm just trying to look at one unit cell. So this, just to kind of go over, is simple cubic Bravais lattice with a motif that has 2 ions per point, one of them chlorine at the vertices, so represented by the origin in this case, and then a cesium ion associated with each point at 1/2, 1/2, 1/2 vector away from the origin, right? So that's how I can construct the cesium chloride structure, right? Because the cesium chloride structure is not a Bravais lattice. That is a combination of Bravais lattice plus motif. And that's how we can construct every single crystal structure that you're going to see. And there's usefulness to talking about the Bravais lattice because that gives us a lot of information about symmetry and so forth.